The phone buzzed on the counter like a trapped insect, and I glanced over without thinking because trust had become habit. A preview bloomed last night. Was worth the risk. Michael said, "Sarah, whose message is that?" She reached faster than me, but I was already reading a thread that flowered like bruises. Sarah said, "It's nothing, just a client." My voice went flat as plates after a storm. Michael said, "A client calls you honey at 1 a.m. I scrolled and saw hotel addresses, coded jokes, and a photo cornered by a blue sheet. Michael said, "Who is Daniel?" She slapped my hand, sharp and unbelieving, and then the silence felt colder than the tile. I stared at the screen as if it might rewrite itself. Sarah said, "You were never supposed to see." A whisper from memory replied, "I don't think he'll ever find out." The realization tightened like a lens until only betrayal and the thud in my chest remained. Michael said, "Say it." She stared past me like I had turned into a stranger. Michael said, "Say what you did." Thunder rolled and the lights shivered. Her mouth opened, then closed, and in that gap my life fell through. The rain kept tapping the window, and the kitchen smelled like burnt toast and adrenaline. Michael said, "Tell me how long." Sarah said, "I don't owe you a breakdown." The word breakdown echoed, because that was exactly what my chest was doing. I tried to count breaths like numbers could dam a flood. Michael said, "Did you love him?" She rubbed the place on her wrist where I had pulled the phone away. Sarah said it was a mistake that kept happening. The fridge hummed like it wanted to interrupt us. I noticed the mug with our vacation photo peeling, as if even the glaze was tired of the lie. Michael said, "Why, Daniel?" She looked at the floor, an ocean she could drown in and avoid mine. Sarah said, "He listened when you were busy." I remembered late nights finishing proposals, believing that effort was devotion. Shame arrived, dressed as logic, telling me I had asked for this by trusting too much. Michael said, "You could have told me you were lonely." She shook her head, and the motion made the air feel thinner. Sarah said, "I told you in 100 small ways, and you liked the silent ones best." A thunderclap pinned us both in place, and nothing else moved. I walked to the hallway, and the house seemed to lean away from me, like it had chosen sides. Michael said, "I need air." The mirror by the door showed a face I recognized by habit, not belief. In the glass I saw our first apartment, cheap plants, a mattress on the floor, and promises stacked like dishes. Michael said, "We grew from nothing." Behind me she whispered to someone who wasn't there. Sarah said, "I didn't mean for it to be this." The word meant felt small against the ice in my ribs. I pulled on my coat and the sleeves felt like restraints. Outside, the streetlight pooled gold on wet asphalt, and I stood there counting the cracks. Michael said, "What do I do now?" I took out my phone and hovered over Emily's name, the friend who knew our timelines better than we did. Michael said, "Please pick up." The call rang, and the sound stitched me to the moment. I hung up after the tone, unable to leave a message that would make sense. Behind the door I heard quiet steps and a drawer, and I tried not to imagine what she put away. The rain softened, the way grief sometimes does, only to return harder. When I went back inside, the kitchen light flickered and steadied, like it had rehearsed this scene. Michael said, "Are you still seeing him?" Sarah said, "I ended it last week." The phone on the counter chimed and exposed the lie without ceremony. A bubble previewed a heart and a room number, and the name at the top was Daniel. Michael said, "He did not get the memo." She pressed her palm to her forehead, as if she could rub away the day. Sarah said, "Please, don't make this worse." The request felt like a joke told at a funeral. I picked up my keys, and the metal sounded too bright. Michael said, "I'm going to a hotel." She looked up startled, as if abandonment belonged to her alone. I slipped the ring into my pocket, and it felt heavier than gold. A message from Jason flashed next, asking about tomorrow's meeting and if everything was okay. I typed nothing and stared at the 3 dots, a tiny heartbeat for a life that might still be stable somewhere. The fridge hummed again, scoring a scene already past saving. I drove aimlessly, letting the wipers drum a rhythm I could survive. Street signs blurred into bright wounds, and the city felt like a witness that would not testify. Michael said, "Breathe." I parked outside a motel with a vacancy sign that blinked like a tired eye. A man smoked under the awning and watched the rain like it was old news. I sat there until the windshield fogged and the car became a small planet I could rule. Michael said, "You are not the sum of her choices." The sentence sounded borrowed, maybe from a podcast I never finished. I texted Emily again and wrote only, "I need you," and hit send before pride could interfere. The phone pulsed with silence that felt almost kind. I took the ring out and set it on the dash, and it rolled until a ridge stopped it from falling. Michael said, "This is the moment everything changes." In the rear view, lightning split the clouds, and for a second my face looked brave. Then the dark closed again, and I was just someone learning how to be alone. Morning light bled through thin curtains, but it felt gray and unfinished. Michael said, "How do I tell my mother this?" The clock ticked with cruel patience, and each sound stretched the silence tighter. He poured coffee, but it tasted like metal and shame. Sarah's perfume lingered on his jacket, a ghost he couldn't shake off. He remembered holding her hand at the hospital when his father passed, her grip steady as stone. Michael said, "Did I imagine that love?" The question cracked inside his chest, unanswered. He called Emily again, the phone buzzing twice before cutting off. The world outside went on, cars and birds, mocking the wreckage inside his head. Michael said, "She broke me because she could." He pressed his forehead to the cool kitchen window, trying to numb the heat in his eyes. Sarah's words echoed, "He listened when you were busy, but he had worked for them both." Michael said, "Was I never enough?" The coffee cup rattled in his hand as thunder from last night returned in memory. He wanted to smash the mug, but instead he swallowed hard and let the bitterness burn. Michael walked into the living room, where framed photos lined the shelf like accusations. One showed Sarah laughing, caught mid-spin in the park, her hair a storm he once worshipped. Michael said, "Why does it still hurt to see you happy?" He dropped onto the couch, the springs sighing under his weight. His phone buzzed with a message from Emily, "Call me when you're ready." He stared at it, afraid to start the story. Michael said, "If I tell it out loud, it becomes permanent." He picked up the photo frame and traced the glass with his thumb, feeling foolish. A picture of their wedding day sat beside it, Sarah's veil lit like sunlight trapped in fabric. Michael said, "I thought vows meant forever." He set the frame down too hard, the corner chipping. A neighbor's dog barked outside, sharp and hollow, pulling him back. He breathed into his palms, fighting the urge to scream. Michael said, "You destroyed me, but I still miss you." The admission echoed in the empty room, loud enough to break him twice. Michael finally called Emily, pacing as the ringtone pulsed. She answered, with a voice already heavy with concern. Emily said, "Michael, what happened?" His throat closed before the words escaped. Michael said, "She's been lying to me." He told her about the phone, the messages, the slap, each detail falling like stones. Emily gasped, "With Daniel?" The silence that followed was proof enough. Michael said, "You knew." She stumbled, "I suspected, but I wasn't sure." Rage boiled under his ribs, but sadness drowned it before it surfaced. Michael said, "You should have told me." Emily's voice cracked, "I wanted to protect you." He pressed his palm into his eyes, until the room went red. Michael said, "You protected her instead." The line carried her sobs, distant but real. For a moment, he wanted her to be here, to anchor him. Instead, he heard his own breath, raw and broken. Michael said, "I don't even know who I am without her." Emily whispered, "Someone better than this." Later, Michael stood at the bathroom sink, the mirror fogging from the shower left untouched. He splashed cold water on his face, but it didn't wash the ache away. Michael said, "You're still here, even when you're gone. Sarah's toothbrush leaned beside his, the bristles bent from habit. He lifted it and almost threw it away, but his hand froze. Michael said, "I can't even let go of plastic." The mirror split his reflection into shards where the light hit. He remembered brushing together on busy mornings, bumping elbows and laughing. Michael said, "That man is dead now." He pressed both palms against the counter until his knuckles whitened. The drain hummed as water circled without purpose, like his thoughts. He looked at his ring finger, pale where the gold used to sit. Michael said, "You made me question my worth." His voice cracked, and the sound startled him. He turned off the tap, but the silence roared louder. By evening, Michael sat on the balcony, city lights flickering like false stars. He held a notebook he hadn't opened in years, its pages yellowed with neglect. Michael said, "If I write, maybe I want to drown." He scribbled thoughts: betrayal, loneliness, the taste of cold coffee. His handwriting wavered, trembling like his hands. Michael said, "You loved him while I built us." He wrote Sarah's name, then scratched it out so hard the paper tore. The air smelled like rain-soaked concrete, sharp and unforgiving. A child laughed 2 floors below, the sound piercing the heaviness. Michael said, "I forgot joy existed." He pressed the pen harder, carving words into the page without ink. His tears blurred the lines, staining the notebook into testimony. Michael said, "I'll never be the same." The city buzzed without mercy, a reminder that his collapse was invisible to everyone else. The morning after felt like a courtroom where every object testified. Michael said, "Show me the pattern." I spread phone bills across the table and traced late-night calls. A ride-share receipt marked a hotel I never stayed in. Michael said, "Blue Lantern, room floor 3. I opened maps and watched a dotted line repeat between our place and the waterfront. Email alerts stacked with calendar blocks, labeled fitness. Michael said, "You never wore running shoes on those nights." A voicemail chimed with a laugh I recognized, and a voice I did not want to name. I paused the audio and stared at my reflection in the black screen. Michael said, "I am not paranoid. I am paying attention." The neighbor's note about a package slipped under the door, time-stamped to another late return. Michael said, "Coincidence is done taking my calls." I gathered everything into a folder because evidence was easier to hold than hope. By noon, I was parked across from the Blue Lantern, watching the revolving door spin stories. Michael said, "If you walk out together, I will not look away." Rain misted the windshield like static on a bad channel. I kept the engine low and the radio off. A black sedan pulled up, and a familiar silhouette stepped out, shoulders squared like a habit. Michael said, "That is him." Minutes dragged until another figure appeared with a scarf I bought last winter. They did not touch, but their distance had the intimacy of a secret. Michael said, "Proximity is a language too." He checked his watch as she checked hers, then both looked up in the same beat. The valet whistled, and the world pretended not to notice. Michael said, "I see you." I raised my phone and captured the smallest tell, the mirrored way they moved toward the curb. Back home, I opened our cloud library and searched dates that had felt wrong. Michael said, "Give me the day you canceled dinner." A live photo expanded and sound spilled out, a soft laugh smudged by room echo. The frame showed a hotel glass with a blue coaster. I scrubbed the clip and caught her reflection passing in the mirror. Michael said, "You recorded your own alibi and forgot me inside it." My chest thudded like a fist on a locked door. I screenshotted the timestamp and dragged it beside the calendar entry, marked Jim. Emily texted, "Do you want me there?" Michael said, "I need you for the truth, not the bandage." Another alert surfaced, a loyalty program email with stay points she never mentioned. Michael said, "Routines confess when people will not." I met Emily at a quiet cafe where cups clinked like careful confessions. Emily said, "You look like you have not slept in days." Michael said, I have been sleeping inside questions. I slid the photos across the table, and she winced before she looked. Emily said, I saw her near his building once. The air thinned between us, and I counted 3 beats to breathe. Michael said, why keep that from me? She held the rim of her cup like it could anchor her. Emily said, I was afraid to break you. The honesty cut clean and deep. Michael said, silence did it slower. She nodded and pushed a napkin toward me with an address she remembered. The room's music swelled and retreated, like waves that brought wreckage to shore. Michael said, thank you for telling me now. I folded the napkin and felt a terrible calm. Twilight found me outside an apartment Emily had circled, a block from the river. Michael said, if they meet here, I will know for certain. Streetlights hummed and the air smelled like wet iron. I stood with a book like a prop and listened to footsteps spill from the stairwell. A door opened and laughter traveled first, familiar and bright that way. Michael said, I can hate a sound I used to love. A shadow crossed the blinds, then another, overlapping like a vow broken twice. I did not move closer because the truth did not need my breath on it. Michael said, tomorrow I confront, tonight I collect myself. A cyclist rattled past and scattered the moment into small pieces. I memorized the rhythm of their voices and the pause where a kiss might live. Michael said, rising is not the same as healing, but it is motion. The apartment was darker than the storm outside, and Sarah sat across from me like a stranger rehearsing lines. Michael said, how long have you been feeding him pieces of me? She flinched, her eyes darting to the floor as though the tiles held mercy. Sarah said, Daniel promised connections. He said he'd help your career if I helped him. The words scraped worse than the silence. Michael said, you thought betrayal was charity? Her hands twisted the edge of her sleeve, guilt woven into cotton. Sarah said, I believed I was saving us. I laughed without humor. The sound cracked and sharp. Michael said, you sold me for a future he never meant to give. She whispered, I didn't mean for it to go this far. My chest tightened like a door locked from the inside. The truth had hands, and it held me still. Jason met me in a quiet parking garage, his coat collar turned up like he was hiding from ghosts. Michael said, why call me here? He shoved a folder into my hands, and papers whispered secrets as they slid. Jason said, emails, contracts, proof he's been using Sarah to leak your work. My chest sank like stone in water. Michael said, you knew all along. Jason's jaw tightened. Jason said, I suspected, but I was scared to be next. I flipped the pages and saw my proposals stamped with Daniel's name, my words in someone else's font. Michael said, they built an empire out of my bones. Jason looked away, unable to stand under the weight of my stare. Michael said, this isn't just betrayal, this is theft. I found Daniel at the riverfront, his reflection taller than truth in the black water. Michael said, you stole my work and my life. Daniel smirked, straightening his suit like armor. Daniel said, I didn't steal, I took what you left exposed. Rage pulsed under my ribs, but his calm was a weapon sharper than fists. Michael said, you used Sarah to bleed me dry. He chuckled low, like I was naive. Daniel said, she came willingly, and she gave me everything you never noticed. The words struck harder than the wind cutting through my coat. Michael said, you planned this for years. His eyes gleamed under the street lamp. Daniel said, I don't plan, I win. The river moved slow, carrying echoes I could never drown. Back home, Sarah's eyes were swollen from tears she hadn't let me see. Michael said, you let him buy your loyalty with promises. She shook her head fast, desperate. Sarah said, he paid for my grad courses. I thought it was for us. The confession hit harder than the slap days before. Michael said, you sold me for tuition. Her voice cracked. Sarah said, I believed he'd hire you, give us stability. My laugh was hollow, a blade scraping walls. Michael said, You betrayed me for a man who never cared about either of us. She pressed her palms against her face, muffling her sobs. Michael said, rescue doesn't come dressed in deceit. She looked up, mascara streaked like scars, and whispered, I didn't know how else to save us. The boardroom smelled of polished wood and betrayal. Daniel stood at the head with my proposal on the screen, my words stolen but polished in his tone. Michael said, that's mine. The directors leaned forward, curious but silent. Emily slipped me a flash drive under the table, her whisper sharp. Emily said, proof he hacked your drafts. My pulse pounded louder than their applause. Michael said, you can't rewrite history with my voice. Daniel smirked, lifting a glass of water like a toast. Daniel said, watch me. I slammed the drive onto the table. Michael said, play it. Screens flickered as evidence filled the room. Emails, metadata, timestamps. Silence drowned the applause, replaced by the sound of Daniel's mask cracking. For the first time his smirk trembled. Confrontation in the living room burned hotter than the storm outside. Michael said, I gave you everything, and you traded it for scraps. Sarah clutched her hands together like they might keep her from breaking apart. Sarah said, I was drowning, and he offered air. The admission stabbed sharper than denial. Michael said, you called it air, but it was poison. She shook her head, tears cutting down her cheeks, her voice shaking. Sarah said, I wanted to feel alive again. My chest heaved, a furnace of fury and grief. Michael said, at my expense, at the cost of my trust. The words rang heavy, heavier than the rain hammering the windows. She reached for me, but I stepped back, the distance between us a canyon carved in one night. The encounter became a battlefield again, but this time no phone vibrated to betray her. Michael said, why him? Why Daniel? She leaned against the island, eyes swollen but fierce. Sarah said, because he saw me when you didn't. I slammed my hand against the marble, the sound sharp as thunder. Michael said, I saw you every day I carried us. She shouted back, voice raw. Sarah said, you carried your work, not me. The words detonated between us, shattering what scraps remain. Michael said, you confuse neglect with survival. My voice cut like glass, but inside I was bleeding. She lowered her gaze, trembling. Sarah said, maybe I never knew what love was. I stepped outside onto the balcony, air heavy with rain, city buzzing below. Michael said, you made me invisible. Behind me, her voice cracked like glass breaking. Sarah said, I still love you. I spun, fury sparking in my eyes. Michael said, love doesn't destroy, it builds. She pressed her palms against the sliding door, her silhouette distorted by the glass. Sarah said, please don't walk away. Lightning cut the sky, etching her outline in silver. Michael said, you've already walked away, long before tonight. Her mouth opened, but no sound followed. The storm roared louder than her silence, and I felt it echo in my chest. Inside again, I faced her with every ounce of fury left. Michael said, you think love is forgiveness on demand? She shook her head, hair falling across her damp cheeks. Sarah said, no, I think love is endurance, and I fail. The words fell like broken glass. Michael said, you didn't fail love, you failed me. My voice cracked, anger fraying into despair. She stepped closer, trembling. Sarah said, hate me if you must, but don't erase me. I closed my eyes, but the images wouldn't fade her laugh, her lies, her betrayal. Michael said, you already erased us. The sentence tore through both of us, leaving only silence. The climax broke like thunder, unavoidable and final. Michael said, this ends tonight. Her lips quivered, but she didn't argue. Sarah said, then let me say goodbye. She stepped forward and reached for my hand, but I pulled it away like it burned. Michael said, no goodbyes, just consequences. She gasped, her eyes wide with shock, realizing there was no undoing this. Michael said, "You will live with what you've done." My chest collapsed inward, every word a blade slicing both of us. She sobbed, collapsing onto the couch, her cries hollow and endless. Michael said, "And I will live with who I've become." The storm outside roared as if to seal the verdict. The apartment looked like an emptied stage, each object left behind a prop from a broken play. Michael said, "Silence has become my roommate." The couch sagged under the memory of her cries, but tonight it held only shadows. I boxed her belongings, each sweater and trinket carrying its own dagger. Michael said, "This shirt still smells like rain." I sealed the box anyway, pressing tape over the scent. The kitchen echoed with metallic clinks as I washed a single mug. Mine now, not ours. Michael said, "Even the faucet sounds lonely." The ring sat on the counter, small but heavy, glinting with betrayal in tungsten glow. I stared at it like a relic from another life. Michael said, "Objects can't lie, only people can." My chest tightened, but I let the ring lie where it fell. The night outside hummed with traffic, but inside, the only sound was my own breath dragging forward. Morning sunlight forced its way through blinds, turning dust into floating memories. Michael said, "Every particle remembers her." I sat at the dining table, notebook open, trying to turn grief into sentences. The words came jagged, ink bleeding where my hand trembled. Michael said, "Pain makes poor poetry." I tore the page, crumpled it, and tossed it at the trash can, missing by inches. The ball of paper rolled back toward me like the past refusing to leave. I picked up another pen, darker ink, sharper nib. Michael said, "I'll write myself back together." I scrawled words like survival, scars, silence. The lines etched across the page like trenches carved in paper. Michael said, "Each line is proof I'm still breathing." The city outside woke, horns and chatter muffled through walls. But my war was quieter, fought with pen and persistence. I met Emily again, this time in a bookstore cafe. Safer ground for fragile words. Emily said, "You look lighter, even if only by an inch." I sipped bitter coffee and let her watch me rebuild. "New," Michael said, "I've started writing again." She smiled faintly, relief showing in the tilt of her eyes. Emily said, "That's the man I remember." I told her about the boxes, the ring, the empty mug that clinked like loneliness. She listened, no interruptions, no judgment. Michael said, "Do you think healing means forgiving?" Emily placed her hand over mine, steady and warm. Emily said, "Forgiving yourself." "Yes, forgiving them, only if you want to." My chest loosened for the first time in days. Michael said, "I don't know if I'll ever forgive, but I will live." Her nod was slow but certain, like an anchor dropped in storm water. Later, I walked through the park, the air sharp with autumn. Children laughed near the swings, their joy cutting clean through my fog. Michael said, "I had forgotten the sound of innocence." I sat on a bench, notebook on my lap, watching leaves fall like fragile truths. An older man feeding pigeons nodded at me, his quiet approval unexpected. Michael said, "Life doesn't pause because you're broken." The pigeons scattered at a child's shout, feathers spinning like torn paper. I wrote betrayal, loss, renewal. My pen steadied for the first time. Michael said, "Pain doesn't own me anymore." The breeze lifted a page and pressed it against my chest before I could catch it. I smiled, letting it go. Michael said, "Some stories don't need to be kept." That evening, I stood by the window, city lights flickering like fragile stars. Michael said, "This pain will not vanish, but it will not cage me." I placed the final sealed box by the door, ready for her to collect. The ring still lay on the counter, but now it looked smaller, powerless. Michael said, "This is not freedom yet, but it's a start." I breathed deep, chest rising not from rage but resolve. The silence no longer pressed me flat. It stretched wide like new ground. Michael said, "I survived." My reflection in the glass looked older, sadder, but steadier. Tomorrow was still unknown, but tonight, I had chosen myself. The boxes were gone, carried out earlier that morning, leaving hollow spaces like wounds on shelves. Michael said, "Absence has its own weight." The air was cleaner, lighter, yet it cut sharper against my chest. I touched the empty dresser top, where once her perfume bottles stood like soldiers guarding lies with fragrance. Michael said, "I remember every scent even now." In the kitchen, her favorite mug was missing, leaving only mine, chipped but loyal. I lifted it, filled it with coffee, and sat in silence. Michael said, "This quiet belongs to me now." The sunlight crawled across the floor like it was reclaiming the apartment. I opened the notebook, flipping past words soaked in grief, landing on a blank page. Michael said, "Today begins without her shadow." The pen in my hand shook, but steadied as ink marked the start of something unbroken. I met Emily at the Riverwalk, where the water mirrored the sky's pale gray. Emily said, "How does it feel now that she's gone?" I exhaled, my breath visible in the crisp air. Michael said, "Strange, like learning how to breathe again." We leaned against the railing, pigeons cooing nearby. Emily said, "You look stronger even if you don't believe it yet." Her words sank deep, filling cracks I had ignored. Michael said, "I thought strength meant holding on, but it means letting go." She placed her hand gently on my arm, grounding me. Emily said, "Then let go fully, not just in pieces." The river shifted, carrying leaves toward the horizon. Michael said, "The current doesn't return what it takes." My voice was soft but sure. She nodded, watching the water. The silence between us was no longer heavy, it was healing. At night, I visited my parents' home, where the smell of old books and wood polish wrapped me in memory. My mother looked at me with cautious eyes. Mother said, "You've lost weight." I smiled faintly, unable to deny it. Michael said, "I've lost more than that." She placed her hand on my shoulder, her touch steady as stone. Mother said, "But you've also found something. You survived." I nodded, though tears blurred the old photos on the wall, snapshots of who I once was. Michael said, "Survival doesn't feel like victory yet." My father, silent as always, placed a warm cup of tea in front of me, his only language comfort. Michael said, "Sometimes words aren't needed." The house hummed with old clocks ticking, reminding me of time I still own. I let the warmth of family stitch what betrayal had torn apart. Days later, I returned to the park bench, notebook in hand, where pigeons once scattered at laughter. Michael said, "This is where I choose to begin again." The wind rustled leaves across the pavement, their dance gentle rather than cruel. I wrote words not of loss, but of renewal, healing, courage, hope. Michael said, "Scars tell stories worth keeping." Children ran by, their joy untamed, and I smiled without pain this time. An old man passed, nodding at me again, as though granting silent approval. Michael said, "Even strangers see I'm still here." The ink flowed steady, my hand no longer trembling. Each line built instead of broke, and the pages filled faster than I could stop them. Michael said, "This is no longer survival, it's living." The sun dipped low, bathing the park in gold. The final night came with quiet clarity. I stood by the window of my apartment, city lights flickering like broken stars stitched into the sky. Michael said, "This story ends, but my life does not." The ring still sat where I left it, no longer heavy, just metal. I picked it up, feeling its cold circle, and set it gently in the drawer. Michael said, "You didn't think I'd ever find out, did you?" The words were whispered, not for her, but for myself. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but peace. I closed the notebook, pages full of scars transformed into strength. Michael said, "I am not defined by betrayal, but by how I rise after it." The city outside buzzed, uncaring, but I no longer needed it to pause for me. The story ended, but I was still standing.